A cold December night. Men disguised as Mohawk warriors. Hundreds of chests of tea disappearing into dark harbor waters without a single arrest. The Boston Tea Party is remembered as a spontaneous act of rebellion, but what if it was actually a carefully planned political operation? Behind the broken crates and floating tea leaves lies a deeper story of power, propaganda, and a revolution still undecided. In the early 1770s, Boston was a city on edge. It was a busy port town, deeply tied to the Atlantic economy, yet increasingly trapped by British imperial control. The American colonies were not fighting for independence yet. Most colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects. What they wanted was something far more specific, the rights they believed were guaranteed under the British Constitution. For more than a decade, tensions had been rising between Britain and its American colonies. After the costly 7 Years' War, fought largely to defend colonial interests, the British government was burdened with debt. Parliament looked to the colonies as a logical source of revenue. The result was a series of taxes and regulations, most notably the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, that colonists believed violated a fundamental principle: no taxation without representation. Protests erupted across the colonies. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Crowds intimidated tax collectors into resigning. Pamphlets and newspapers spread arguments about liberty, natural rights, and the limits of parliamentary power. While many of these early taxes were repealed after backlash, one tax remained: the duty on tea. Tea was not just a beverage. It was a daily ritual in colonial life and one of the most widely consumed imported goods. By keeping the tea tax in place, Parliament asserted its right to tax the colonies, even after admitting earlier taxes had been a mistake. To British lawmakers, the tax was small and symbolic. To many colonists, it represented a dangerous precedent. At the same time, the British East India Company was facing financial collapse. Once the most powerful trading company in the world, it was drowning in debt and sitting on massive stores of unsold tea. Parliament stepped in with a solution: the Tea Act of 1773. Contrary to popular belief, the Tea Act did not raise taxes on tea. In fact, it made tea cheaper for colonists by allowing the East India Company to sell directly to American merchants, bypassing colonial middlemen. From Britain's perspective, this would undercut smugglers and save the company. From the colonists' perspective, it was a trap. The issue was not price, it was principle. By buying the tea, colonists would be accepting Parliament's right to tax them without representation. Even worse, the Tea Act granted the East India Company a near monopoly, threatening the livelihoods of local merchants and smugglers who had long supplied cheaper, untaxed tea. Resistance quickly spread. In cities like New York and Philadelphia, ships carrying East India Company tea were turned away. In Charleston, tea was unloaded but locked in warehouses, where it eventually rotted. Boston, however, faced a unique crisis. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor carrying 342 chests of tea. Under British law, if the tea was not unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days, the cargo would be seized by authorities. The ship owners wanted to return the tea to Britain. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, whose own sons were among the tea consignees, refused. He insisted the tea be landed and the tax collected. For weeks, Boston held its breath. Town meetings were called, drawing thousands of people, an extraordinary number for the time. Samuel Adams and other leaders of the Patriot movement argued that allowing the tea ashore would be a surrender of colonial rights. They demanded the ships leave. On December 16, 1773, the deadline arrived. That evening, a massive meeting at the Old South Meeting House ended in deadlock. Governor Hutchinson still refused to back down. As night fell, a signal was given. What happened next was not a riot. It was disciplined, organized, and remarkably controlled. Between 30 and 60 men, many disguised with face paint and Native American clothing, marched quietly toward Griffin's Wharf. Their disguises were symbolic, meant to represent an American identity separate from Britain. They boarded the ships, split into teams, and began breaking open tea chests with axes and hammers. For nearly 3 hours, the men worked methodically. Tea was dumped into the harbor, crate by crate. Any tea that washed ashore was pushed back into the water. When a padlock was accidentally broken, it was replaced the next day at the protesters' expense. No other cargo was touched. No crew members were harmed. By the end of the night, over 90,000 pounds of tea, worth millions in today's dollars, had been destroyed. Boston Harbor was filled with floating tea leaves. The message was unmistakable. News of the event spread quickly throughout the colonies and across the Atlantic. To supporters of the Patriot cause, the Boston Tea Party was an act of courage and resistance against tyranny. To British officials, it was outright destruction of private property and a direct challenge to imperial authority. Parliament responded swiftly and harshly. In 1774, it passed a series of punitive measures known in Britain as the Coercive Acts and in America as the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. Massachusetts self-government was drastically limited. British troops were quartered in private homes. Colonists accused of crimes could be tried outside the colony. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, these measures united the colonies. Even those who had disapproved of the Tea Party now feared that British power was unchecked. In response, colonial leaders called the First Continental Congress, bringing representatives from 12 colonies together for the first time. The Boston Tea Party did not immediately lead to independence. Many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. But it changed the nature of the conflict. It shifted the struggle from protest to open defiance. It forced people to choose sides. It also reshaped the use of political symbolism. The Tea Party was carefully framed by Patriot leaders as a moral act, not a criminal one. Participants avoided personal gain, emphasized order, and controlled the narrative through pamphlets and newspapers. In doing so, they transformed destruction into legitimacy. In the years that followed, the event took on a life of its own. Early Americans celebrated it as a founding moment of resistance. By the 19th century, it was woven into national mythology, a bold, unified stand against oppression. But the reality was more complex. Not all colonists supported the action. Loyalists saw it as lawlessness. Many ordinary people worried about the consequences. And the men who dumped the tea were not peasants rising up spontaneously, they were merchants, artisans, and political organizers, acting with intent. The Boston Tea Party was not inevitable. It was the result of years of escalating mistrust, economic pressure, and ideological conflict. It was a calculated gamble that British authority could be challenged without being crushed, and that gamble laid the seeds of revolution. Less than 2 years later, shots would be fired at Lexington and Concord. The path to independence would become irreversible. But on that cold December night in 1773, no one could be certain of the outcome. All they knew was that once the tea hit the water, there was no turning back. The Boston Tea Party was not just about tea. It was about who held power, who made the rules, and whether ordinary people had the right to resist authority they believed was unjust. That question would define the American Revolution and continue to echo through history long after the last tea leaf sank beneath Boston Harbor. In the months after the harbor was cleared and the last traces of tea were gone, Boston did not celebrate. The city suffered. With the port closed by British order, merchants lost their livelihoods, workers were thrown into poverty, and supplies became scarce. Yet instead of collapsing under pressure, the colonies responded with an unprecedented show of unity. Food, money, and supplies poured into Boston from as far away as South Carolina. What had begun as a local act of resistance was now a continental cause. British officials, meanwhile, struggled to understand what had gone wrong. From London's perspective, the Tea Act had been a reasonable solution to a financial crisis. They believed the colonists had overreacted, manipulated by radical agitators. But this misunderstanding only deepened the divide. Parliament failed to grasp that the conflict was no longer about a single tax or a shipment of tea. It was about sovereignty, who ultimately had the authority to govern the lives of the colonists. Within the colonies, the Boston Tea Party hardened political identities. Moderates who once argued for compromise found themselves increasingly marginalized. Loyalists, many of whom had quietly supported British rule, became more vocal and more vulnerable. Families split along ideological lines. Communities fractured. Neutrality became nearly impossible. The event also reshaped how resistance was organized. Committees of correspondence expanded, ensuring rapid communication between colonies. Political mobilization became more sophisticated, blending public meetings, printed propaganda, and symbolic acts. The Tea Party had shown that carefully staged resistance could shift public opinion and force powerful institutions to react. Even the participants themselves were changed. For years, many kept their identities secret, fearing retaliation. Some later became prominent figures in the revolution, while others returned quietly to their trades. Yet all carried the knowledge that they had crossed a line, from protest within the system to defiance against it. Looking back, the Boston Tea Party stands as a reminder that revolutions are rarely born from chaos alone. They are shaped by planning, persuasion, and moments when ordinary people decide that obedience has become more dangerous than resistance. The men who boarded those ships did not know they were making history. They only knew they were sending a message. And Britain heard it, too late. By the time independence was declared in 1776, the Tea Party had already become a symbol of irreversible change. It proved that the bond between colony and empire could be broken, not by armies, but by conviction. The splash of tea into Boston Harbor marked the moment when protest transformed into revolution, and when an argument over taxation became a fight for self-rule. The night the tea was thrown into the sea was not the beginning of the American Revolution, but it was the moment the future could no longer be avoided. In the end, the Boston Tea Party was never about tea. It was about power, identity, and the limits of authority. It exposed the fundamental clash between an empire that believed in parliamentary control and a people who increasingly believed that legitimate government must rest on consent. The destruction of the tea did not immediately create a new nation, but it made coexistence within the old system nearly impossible. Trust was broken on both sides. Britain responded with force, and the colonies responded with unity. Step by step, compromise gave way to confrontation. What makes the Boston Tea Party endure is not its drama, but its clarity. It revealed that resistance could be organized, symbolic, and effective. It showed that ordinary citizens, acting together, could challenge the most powerful empire of their age. And it demonstrated that once people begin to see themselves as something separate, as Americans rather than subjects, the course of history shifts. Today, the Boston Tea Party is remembered as a founding moment not because of what was destroyed, but because of what it created, a shared sense of purpose and a willingness to accept the consequences of dissent. In that cold harbor, under the cover of night, the path toward independence became unavoidable. The tea sank to the bottom of the sea, but the idea it carried rose, and it never disappeared.